up the mountain. And then everybody who was in the back would throw and jump off. They'd throw all their goods off, where it be flour, sugar, or whatever. They'd throw it off the truck because he couldn't stop the truck. So they said they, fell and hurt themselves several times during those incidents. But later on in the 40s and 50s, there were Coopers, Fresnels, Honeycutts, and Stearns. And by the late 40s, the sawmill ceased production. So the logging chapter actually talks a lot about why and what happened, but it also talks about the railroad. And my great-grandfather was an engineer for the Carolina clinch field during the steam engine days. And so he would tell me a lot of stories, and we'll get to that in a minute, because it's the moonshine section. So my great-grandfather was a moonshine maker up on for Higgins Creek in Flag Pond, and there'd be days that he wouldn't come home, nobody would know where he was at, but he'd come home with moonshine. So he would also stop the steam engine. It would take about 3/4 of a mile for it to stop if he was coming from Poplar. But all of them would jump off the train and they would go up to Lost Cove and get moonshine off the Geneva Tipton's family, John D. Tipton, Doc Tipton. And he would say, she would tell me that he would say, boy, that's the best moonshine he's ever had. And it's probably so because of the streams, and the springs that came out of the mountains up there. So in 1877, an estimated number of moonshine stills operating reached 2,000 throughout the North Carolina, Tennessee, Georgia, and Virginia mountains. These distillers ran the stills at least 20 days each month and a daily output of 15 gallons. The government claimed that blockaders were costing the Treasury approximately $2,500,000 yearly, and that the annual loss for moonshine equaled the internal revenue tax throughout the nation. That was a lot of money, right? That's a lot of money in 1877. So, those revenuers did not like that at all. The government did not like that, right? So, like I said, he was John D. Tipton was the hermit of Lost Cove and known throughout western North Carolina as an invader. It took, I want to say it's somewhere in there, but in 1887, the Falcon newspaper out of Elizabeth City, North Carolina, ran this ad, or ran it. And it says, John D. Tipton was captured by Deputy Collector Jeff Hines in Bakersville, North Carolina on May the 25th, 1877, the count reads. Hines, Deputy Collector, came most unexpectedly to object of his search, John D. Tipton, the hermit of Lost Cove, and captured him together with his distillery and apparatus. For 12 years, Tipton has been engaged in his unlawful business, successfully eluding all efforts to entrap or catch him. The deep seclusion of Lost Cove, a wild region among the mountains in Yancey County or in Tennessee, the boundary not yet determined, afforded him a sure hiding place for years. Sometimes his place of operations were discovered and information given to the revenuers, but when they came to secure the prize, he had folded his tents and stolen away distillery and all. So he did invade them for many years, and it's quite interesting because Geneva would tell me he'd stay gone for days, and almost like months, almost to 30 days, I think she said he was gone the longest. And they knew where he was at, right? But not everybody else, And so when revenuers would come up into Lost Cove looking for him, well, they didn't know where he was at, right? Because he wasn't home. And so almost every family, I want to say every family, because a particular Bailey will tell me that his family did not make moonshine, and I'm like, well, you don't know the stories that I know what your grandfather did, because his grandfather was one of the best moonshine makers in the Cove. And so women watched and distracted the revenuers quite often. In Lost Cove, it was disputed territory. In his book entitled News from Yancey County, the article was published that Aiken returned from a trip from Egypt Township in Yancey. Illicit distilling, he says, is on the decrease, and that the only place in Yancey County where the revenue law is being violated is Lost Cove, which section he did not visit. is a section that lies contiguous to both North Carolina and Tennessee, neither state claiming the jurisdiction. And so the two states not definitely known, hence the name of Lost Cove, or the moonshiner, frolics, unmolested. That was in 1898. I love it. I always been fascinated by the language. But it is true. A lot of times, Lost Cove men would go up in front of the courts in Buckham County and Asheville, and R.P. Dick, Judge R.P. Dick was the judge. He was a Democratic judge, and a lot of times that he wouldn't even fine them. He would just send them home. But there were times, because they were in disputed territory, but there were times later in the years that they would get charged. So we'll turn to Mountain View Free Will Baptist Church and the school, because it served as one. In the 1880s, in Lloyd Bailey's book, it was named Tipton's Chapel, and it folded in 1904. The church registry went back and forth, right? And so the second church formed under Jim Beam in 1909, but failed to report minutes with the Jacks Creek Free Will Baptist Association, so it lost its charter in 1919, but families still attended. And then in 1934, the church finally became Mountain View Free Will Baptist under Reverend Bob Miller, whose house I showed you that's slowly going back into the landscape. I don't know if most of you know, but Jacks Creek Free Will Baptist Association has been around for a very, very long time. They have all the books in the Brown Yancey County, the Toe River, of all the Free Will Baptist churches. When they were formed, when they lost the registry, everything. And it's online. So here is, excuse me, a picture of some of those in 1952. Bailey's right in front, and Tipton's are scattered through, so, and Miller's too. I didn't know every name. Teresa Bowman didn't know every name. So there were around 27 members and 35. They did practice plural eldership, communion, foot washing, revivals, and baptisms once a year. I did interview Verno Davis, who lived up on Spivey Mountain, and he was one of the last people to actually preach in Lost Cove. Other honor ministers from 1950 to the 50s were Bob Miller, Honeycutt, Doc Taylor, Quince Miller, Van Hensley, Cecil Higgins, and Albert Wheeler. Verno Davis was just a very neat man. So this is what the school looked like, the church, and these were some of the pictures that photographers had took in around 1952 that had came in there and took pictures of them. So they're all staged pictures, right? And this is one of the earliest photos of the kids. This is around 1930s right here. Carl Young is the teacher then. This is Maud. These are twins, Polly and Dolly Miller. So teachers were John Howe, Bob Holliday, Roy Sprinkley, Paul Young, Hensley, Faye Johnson Miller, which is Teresa Bowman Miller, Ulysses White, and the most notable is Sinclair Conley. Faye Miller taught during the late 1940s and substituted for Conley in the 50s. Conley was the most prominent. He was the one that taught actually to 11th grade. He brought in books from all over what he could collect, right? Because he didn't want all the students to be dumbed down, I guess I should say. So they were taught worldly, you know. And so he taught, he mostly bought the books himself too, because Yancey County, consolidating schools were happening at one point, and so, but he was still coming in there from his house he'd stay with families. All the teachers stayed with families through the week. They would go home on the weekends. So students' grades ranked for K through 12. And so it was hard to keep track of kids, right? Because their age groups range from, 1st grade up to 11th grade. when you have one student that's only in 3rd grade, and you gotta teach them 3rd grade, and you gotta turn around, right, and then you gotta teach a 5th grader, and you gotta teach a 7th. So it was, you know, those standards were so different, and it was hard on the teachers, really. So in the 1950s, more families were leaving, and the Millers and Baileys were 2 of the last to stay. And so the consolidation of Yancey County and Lost Cove schools were then happened. And older students had to leave and attend 12th grade at D-Log, and that would be Isaiah Bailey was one of those who I interviewed. So here, of course, I mentioned some of the families. In the families section, it's probably one of the biggest chapters because it starts for the first ones who moved in, and then it goes down to the ones who live there, right, and then their family. I don't talk too much about, you know, getting way down deep into it, but it will talk a lot about it. So what happened? So it's timber depletion. You know, now when you walk in there, everything's grown back up. But in the 80s, you could see growth coming, spurting out. But passenger trains, they quit, you know, around 1953. Faye Miller would have to walk into Lost Cove to teach. She couldn't ride a train, and so she would walk in with high heels. And I don't know how in the world she did it, because I got a picture of her standing on the railroad tracks with high heels and a dress, and I'm like, you know, and Teresa, there's pictures in the book of her daughter Teresa, and Teresa was 3 years old when she went with her mom to teach, and they stayed at Chester Bailey's house. And Teresa was 3 years old and had a birthday, and they had a huge birthday party for her, so those pictures are in the book as well. And so Sinclair Colony was the first one that petitioned for a road, but it just never happened due to the cost and funding. They thought maybe it was only going to cost around $10,000, but when actually the transportation, you know, the road people came in to look at it, it was going to cost them way too much, like well over $800,000. So it's not going to happen, right, for the amount of people who were still in the code. And then, of course, you had men like J.C. Bryant. He went to the Korean War, and O.P. Bailey had gone to World War II. And so with education and the consolidation and the selling of generational lands, which would eventually happen, the only people who own land in Lost Cove to this day is Euless Miller. And Marie Tipton, which is a descendant. She owns like maybe 2-point-something acres. But the rest are from people from from Raleigh, North Carolina. So then let's see. Show you this. Hopefully it shows it. Okay, there's a bigger picture. That's a bigger expanded picture. So like this, if you could see that little part right there, it's a man-made, it's like a go-kart really. It just had like a lever for a brake. And Belmer Bailey, he built that for the kids. And so in the Cove it goes down, you know, like that, and they would ride it down the road all the time. So, and then this is Servilla Bailey, which is Belmer's wife, and Phyllis Node. She lives in Jonesboro. And this is one of the pictures. This is Mr. Connolly with Phyllis when she was really little, and Hosea, and that's Elsie, and we're not for sure who that young man is. And if y'all saw that one. This is one of the pictures that was staged, because really they would have, you know, a washing tub, right, next to the fire in the house. And Hazel or any of the mothers, they would actually boil the water, right? And so the youngest child would actually be, I hate to say it, but would actually be in, you know, the last one to get in, so the water was cold, right? And all the soap and all the lye or whatever. It was awful. Geneva said it was the most awfulest thing you could imagine. But they staged that, right? They staged that because in the early 50s, there was a huge article in the Parade magazine and I've been trying to find it, but it had these pictures in it. So this is what these were some of the pictures that were staged. Yeah, you can see, they said like three of them could get on there. And this is Velmer and Servilla, and he is showing her his fro, which was a tool used during the sawmill. He actually made that. And that's Hosea on the cart. If you could see the little lever right there, you see the little lever he's got right there? It was like a wire that went to the front of it. And then this is Chester Bailey. He was a cook for the railroad union. A lot of people, there were at times, especially with the African American men who worked the railroad, they would come to church there a lot. And there was once a black preacher who actually was able to speak at the church during the year, and y'all seen that one. So, and that's the bigger one of Carly and the kids. I think that's you was right there. Oh, and this one, hog skinning, right? Yeah. Actually, John Mueller's up here. You can't see him. But there's Conley, and I want to say Swin. I can't remember that one, but that's it. They're all, most all of these, well, all of these are in the book. So that's it. Okay. Any questions? I don't want to give away everything, right? Like, I don't want to give away everything.
Everybody was dressed really nice, and we typically think of hillbilly Appalachia. I mean,
we've been saying that for years, right? I mean, you know, that's that romanticism and that.
I mean, even the magazines came in
Well,
and they were dressed nice, but
well,
then you
most of
see
them
other
didn't.
magazines
Right.
that they weren't dressed nice, clearly.
I think they made their own clothes, right, a lot of times, and they got them from Sears and Roebuck. And, you know, even in the early heydays of Unicoi County, downtown in Middle Irwin, there was tons of stores. So they traveled there to, you know, get clothes and stuff like that. But they all dressed. I mean, I think Velmer Bailey wore a suit almost every day. You know, it wasn't, you know, it's that generational thing,
I
right?
mean, even the little kids look like they were dressed
Yes,
well.
and they did.
And we're not talking about
but now,
sack.
right, but now it's not so much, you know. Now we don't dress up, because back in the 20s and 30s, you know, you think of all that, men wore hats, women wore hats.
Yeah.
You know, we dressed up constantly, we're more professional.
Especially if they knew the picture was
They what, Jane?
Especially if they knew the picture was
Was getting taken.
So even in that school
Or
picture,
Sunday
every
best
kid was
for
dressed
that.
well.
Yeah, Edgar Maud even had, like a little fur thing, or like a little fur, you know, around her shawl or over. So, yeah.
I mean, I guess what I'm saying is if I was gonna come take pictures with the poor kids to get money, I would want them to not dress good.
Right.
And yet they were
And yet they were.
dressing really well.
Yeah. And not all of those were when the photographers were in there. So like the church picture, that wasn't from the photographers, only the ones that were, you could see the boys on the
Right,
park and
those
stuff like that,
photos.
yeah. Yes, sir.
Was all of the timber that was cut and sawn, taken to the sawmill as sawn timber, or were logs actually taken off onto the railroad?
Logs were actually, let me take that back. No, it was all timber that they brought. They did all the log splitting and everything at the sawmill.
Okay.
And then they would just transfer it down there to the railroad tracks, and then it would be shipped.
There was a tremendous amount of timber taken out of there. That was all hand loaded
Yes.
on the train.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, they worked like JC was saying, they worked sun up to sundown, right? And so for many years, it was mostly, definitely making the acid pulpwood and stuff too. And so they were really like dyed, their hands would be just, completely destroyed, right? So, but, so everybody just about in there worked there, so.
So in 1925, when that, you have that quote on the timber manufacturer that it would last 8 years at the typical rate. Is that, they're talking about the old road? Is
Yeah,
that about how long it lasts?
they would last, yeah. Because now when you look at, well, you know, I was in there in 2019, it's so growed up. I mean, it's huge, you know. Like I said, you at one point see all the way to your naked mountain, you can't even do that no more. So,
There's no poplar trees are left, are there?
poplar?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, there's
Or
tons,
there's
oh,
a-
yeah, there's
okay.
tons of poplar trees in there. Yeah, there's tons of poplars. So, yeah, I mean, you know, there's not many remnants of anything in graveyards. You know, you can see the graveyard and Swing Miller's truck still there with bullet holes in it and everything, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting that, because, you know, the cemetery sits on a knoll, up on a hill, and so a lot of times it's kind of like I always say it's good mushroom hunting, because there's no debris on the bottom, on the grave, so it sits up there pristine. And they still go in there, family relatives who have people in there, they go in there and, for Memorial Day, you know, and put the flowers on it and everything. There's a lot of children in there.
What are the earliest graves in there?
Well,
That you know?
there's a couple, 1 and 2, Odell, Guthrie was one of the earliest, he's 18 months old. He's in there, he died from meningitis, and his mother is in there, she died young too. Well, his mother was young when she died, she was like early 40s. They're both in there. Bonnie Miller is 16 years old, she's in there. Some of them died from tuberculosis, some of them meningitis.
So the Spanish flu, like it?
No. You know, we talk about, you know, we always talk about the chestnut tree, right, and stuff like that, and the blight of 1920 that come through, and there are 2 chestnut trees up there, and they're massively huge. Now, are they an original American chestnut? I don't know. I know the last time I took a professor from North Carolina in there, and so, but I don't know if he ever determined if it was or not. Yeah, they're massively huge. I mean, they're probably, you know, trunk-wise, I can't even see how big they are.
If they are, they might be useful to the folks who are trying to reestablish them.
Yeah.
You know, find hybrids that were
Yeah, scale,
resistant to
what
it.
is it they do, scale and all that. I mean, the families always thought that they would go back. I mean, and that's why they left a lot of their stuff in the houses. And so, when Mr. Keeley in the book, it talks about Mr. Keeley and Mr. Canoy, who were from Greensboro, North Carolina, and there's other people from North Carolina, Thomas, Byron Thomas, and there was another, John Moss, no, it's not John Moss, but there were a couple of people who, from that area, that Raleigh Triad area, had bought land in there because they had seen all the newspapers talking about it. And so, they were like, hey, let's get a hold of the families and let's buy that land, and they did. And so, after the families left, which the official last, church was in December of 1957, but the Belmer Bailey's family, Chad Bailey's family, didn't leave to January 1st of 1958. And they hauled out whatever they could. They took a pig with them, you know, there's things that they took with them. But they left a lot of stuff. I mean, there was beds, there was furnishings, there was a lot. And then when people started reading about it, they started coming in there and they started pillaging and taking things. And so that's when Mr. Keeley actually hired Grant Ward to come in there to live, and he was there until around 1977. He was a one-armed man with a shotgun. And you did not want to cross him, because he would shoot you dead, you know, but anyway.
So other than hogs, cows, some chickens, was there anything else that they raised? It seemed like there was a cornfield in one of the pictures. Was there anything that they raised to support themselves, or did they get everything from
Tobacco, they did,
So you
yeah.
get tobacco and corn.
Tobacco, corn was a major crop, you know, they
And
had
that
horses.
was for
I mean, they had
moonshine, yes.
horses they used to own, you know.
I mean, the corn mainly for moonshine, I would think.
Yeah.
Easier to transport than
And they
road.
made, yeah, and they made brandy,
Not
out
easier
of
to
the,
deny.
they made brandy out of, or well, what Geneva would, you know, there's a difference between corn liquor and moonshine, right? And they would make both.
Okay.
One would be like berries in with it, you know, like the moonshine would be like berries in the berries that they have, that they would, you know, use.
Well, is the land Tennessee or Carolina?
It's North Carolina. And they didn't determine it until the twenties, or maybe around 1918, somewhere around there. But even still, I mean, John D Tiffany, I mean, he's buried there. One of the first people. Morgan Bailey's buried on the Toad River, in the Yellow Jacket Cemetery, Bailey Cemetery, his father's cemetery. And, but there's Tipton's, Miller's, there's about 30-something, 34 some of the graves in there. Some of them are unmarked, they're just little stones. Nola Bailey's in there, she was like 2 years old. And so, you know, and so there's some that are unmarked. Jetty Bailey's in there, she was married to William Bailey. So yeah, there's.
So from what you said, I'm guessing there wasn't a lot of mortality of newborns? I mean, not a lot of newborns died.
No. I mean, now there are some, but it's not a whole lot. I mean, I want to say there's like maybe 5 at the most that was born and died the same day, but they're not buried in the cove.
Oh, okay.
They're not buried in the cove. They're either buried in Martins Creek Cemetery, which is on the south end of Irwin. A lot of people that from the cove are buried there. Evergreen Cemetery, which is the biggest cemetery in Unicoi County. And then there's some that's buried in the Swingle Cemetery in Unicoi. Some Millers and Bailey's are buried there too. But I mean, you know, it's been a long process. I mean, it's not, you know, it's been way too long, I think. So, but I wanted to capture as much as I could that was truth, right? And so that's why those oral stories are in there, because that's where most of the accounts came from anyway, you know. And of course there are things from Patricia Beaver that talks about, you know, land and kinship. I mean, there's books in there, the History of Western North Carolina by John Alexander Arthur, which is a great book because it talks about R.P. Dick and the Moonshine. And so there's a lot of, you know, different good materials that are in there. And the rest are, you know, cool little articles from all over the country, from California, New York, San Diego to San Antonio about Lost Cove. Florida, I mean, they're from everywhere, you know. Yes, Dr. Tedesco.
Great research, Christy, really. I want to say, did you say there was no electricity in there?
Yeah, no electricity.
So people there didn't have radio?
No, they brought in one of the Christmas presents that they got in 1952-53 was a battery operated radio.
Okay.
And it really like just was, you know, the kids never seen one before,
Wow.
so it was very shocking for them to hear that on the radio was Santa, you know, and Santa was supposed to come to Lost Cove, and then like minutes later showed up, and they were like really surprised.
So they found out there was no news. I was thinking that, you know, you said people went off to World War II and the Korean War. So again, did they find out mainly through print sources and such? So they had no radio to, okay.
Yeah, and traveling back and forth to Irwin, you know,
Yeah,
and word of mouth and
Yeah.
seeing their families and
Yeah.
stuff like that,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there were, you know, there are, in some of the deeds, because those, I probably have, you know, of course, everything's going to come into the archives, so everything will be set here in the archives that I've got researched. And so, some of the deeds actually talk about mineral rights up there. And there are one instance of John D. Tiffany, when he come home, thought of being AWOL, right? That he saw glare of gold up in the mountains from the sun beating off the rocks, right? And Albert Tipton, which was his grandson, actually there's a moonshine story about false gold, false gold. So it does talk about, you know, mineral rights and things like that. But that one time they wanted to get, you know, a pole, especially from Betty Peterson's property to Lost Cove. It was not that far, and they wanted to be able to run the line where the old road, rutted out road was. but they just never